There is a particular quality to the cold that comes off the Great Plains in January. It is not simply low temperature, though the temperatures are genuinely extreme, down to 40 below zero in the worst years in a landscape that offers no natural shelter, no forest to break the wind, no topography to hide behind. The cold of the northern plains in winter is cold with intention, or so it seems to the people who experience it. It comes from the northwest riding a wind that has traveled 1,000 miles across flat country without encountering anything significant enough to slow it down. And it arrives not as a chill but as a physical force, something that penetrates clothing and walls and the spaces between logs and the joints of a person's hands with a thoroughness that makes the idea of warmth seem theoretical. The people who homesteaded the Great Plains in the decades after the Civil War,
fell all night.
the families who took the government's offer of free land under the Homestead Act and built their lives on the flat, treeless, wind-scoured prairies of Kansas and Nebraska and Dakota Territory, understood this cold in a way that is difficult to fully communicate to someone who has not experienced it. They understood it not as a weather event, the way a person in a heated house understands a cold snap, but as a seasonal condition that had to be prepared for with the same seriousness that a military campaign required. With months of advanced planning, with the careful accumulation of specific resources, with contingency thinking about what would happen if the primary plan failed, and with the quiet, unglamorous discipline of people who knew that the margin between adequate preparation and inadequate preparation was measured not in comfort, but in survival. Most of them survived. The ones who did not left behind a record that is instructive in the specific ways that all frontier failures are instructive, not because they were unlucky or foolish, but because the demands of a Great Plains winter were genuinely extreme. And the consequences of getting the preparation wrong were swift and complete. The ones who survived season after season across the decades of the homesteading period left behind a different kind of record.
Welcome,
not dramatic, not often written down in the form that history tends to preserve, but legible to someone who knows how to read it. In the physical evidence of how they built their houses and arranged their farms and calculated their provisions and organized their time in the months before the first snow came, that record is worth reading carefully. The first and most fundamental secret of Great Plains winter survival was a secret that the settlers had to learn and that the landscape itself taught them, often at painful cost. The winter did not begin in December. It began in July. The preparation for a Great Plains winter started in the middle of summer, when the garden was producing and the days were long and the temperature in the sun was 100 degrees, and the idea of a killing blizzard seemed very distant. This was precisely when the preparation had to begin, because the resources that winter survival required, the food, the fuel, the fodder for the animals, had to be accumulated during the months when they were available, and the months when they were available, and the months when they were needed were separated by 5 or 6 months of a calendar that did not wait. The settlers who arrived from the wooded states of the East brought with them an expectation of winter preparation that was calibrated to a different landscape. In Ohio or Indiana or Virginia, winter was cold and sometimes difficult, but wood for fuel was available in quantity. The winters rarely lasted more than 3 months, and a family that ran short of provisions could typically find ways to supplement what they had. The social networks of established communities provided a degree of resilience against individual failures of preparation. On the Great Plains, none of these backup systems existed. There was no wood, or almost none, because the plains were largely treeless, and the timber available along creek bottoms was limited in quantity and jealously conserved. There was no established community with the depth of resources to absorb the shortfalls of its members. There was no mild alternative winter, waiting as a fallback if the preparation proved inadequate. There was the winter, exactly as it was, and what a family had when it arrived was what they had to get through it with. This reality, fully understood and planned for, produced one of the most comprehensive and systematic approaches to seasonal preparation that civilian life in 19th century America ever developed. It was not written down in manuals. It was not taught in schools. It was learned from experience, transmitted through the practical example of neighbors who had survived, and refined across the years of the homesteading period into a body of knowledge that was as specific and as practical as any engineering. Food preservation was the axis around which everything else rotated, because the length of the Great Plains winter, sometimes 5 months, sometimes 6, exceeded the capacity of any family to simply store fresh food. What could not be preserved could not be relied upon. And the forms of preservation available without refrigeration, without canning technology in its modern form, and often without the salt and sugar that preservation required in quantity, were limited and demanded both knowledge and labor. Smoking and drying were the oldest and most reliable methods. Meat, beef, pork, venison, wild turkey, whatever the season in the farm had produced, was smoked over slow fires for days, sometimes weeks, until the moisture content was reduced to the point where bacterial growth was inhibited. The smokehouse was one of the first permanent structures a homesteader built, often before the house itself was complete, because the smokehouse served a function that was not optional. A family without a working smokehouse in September was a family that would be eating through its preserved supplies before March. The smoking process required wood smoke of specific types, hardwoods which produced a dense, dry smoke with the right combination of compounds to inhibit bacterial growth. On the treeless plains, this created an immediate problem. Where did the wood come from? The answer, developed over the first years of plains settlement, was a combination of sources. Cottonwood and willow from creek bottoms, used in combination with dried corn cobs and prairie grass, twisted into tight bundles. The infamous hay bales that plains settlers burned when wood was unavailable. The hay bundles burned hot and fast and had to be constantly replenished, which made them impractical for the slow smoking that meat preservation required. The experienced homesteader learned to combine available fuel sources in the specific proportions that each task demanded. Root cellars were the other essential element of food storage, and the engineering of the root cellar on the Great Plains represented a genuine practical achievement. The cellar had to be deep enough to stay above freezing in the coldest winters, typically 8 to 10 feet below the surface on the northern plains, deeper than equivalent structures in warmer climates. It had to be dry enough to prevent the rot that wet conditions accelerated in stored vegetables. It had to be accessible from the house in blizzard conditions, because a settler who could not reach the root cellar during a 3-day storm was a settler who went without food for 3 days. The positioning of the root cellar relative to the house was therefore one of the critical decisions of farm layout. Not aesthetic, not conventional, but calculated with the specific knowledge that in a blizzard on the Great Plains, a distance of 20 feet between house and root cellar could become impassable. The experienced homesteader positioned the cellar entrance close to the house, connected it, if possible, by a covered passage, or at minimum by a rope strung between the two that could be followed blind in a whiteout, and built the entrance in such a way that a door could be opened against the prevailing wind direction. These were not insights that anyone arrived with. They were lessons that the first winters on the plains taught, and that the settlers who survived them transmitted to those who came after. The question of fuel was, on the treeless plains, more immediately urgent than food, and the solutions that settlers developed for it represent some of the most creative practical engineering of the homesteading period. Buffalo chips, dried bison dung, were the first and most abundant fuel source available on the plains, and the settlers' relationship with this material is one of the more honest and unsentimental stories in the history of the frontier. Buffalo chips burned adequately, if not impressively. They produced a low, steady heat that was sufficient for cooking and for maintaining a barely tolerable temperature inside a sod house or dugout. They required constant management. A fire built entirely of buffalo chips needed attention every 20 or 30 minutes to maintain useful heat, and they produced a smoke that, while not toxic, was unpleasant in the confined spaces of a prairie winter. The collection of buffalo chips was summer and fall work, a task that fell primarily to children who would range across the prairie in the months before winter with sacks or wagon beds, gathering the dried chips that the bison herds had left and stacking them in the large quantities that winter demanded. A family that expected to heat a small house for 5 months with buffalo chips needed, by the calculations of experienced settlers, something on the order of several tons of material. Collecting and stacking that quantity required months of sustained effort that had to be completed before the first snow, because snow-covered chips were wet chips, and wet chips did not burn. The decline of the bison herds through the 1870s and 1880s, one of the great ecological catastrophes of the frontier period, removed this fuel source at precisely the moment when the plains were being most intensively settled. The settlers who arrived in Dakota Territory in the 1880s found neither the bison that their predecessors had relied on for chips, nor the established fuel infrastructure that older settlements had developed. Their first winters were, in many cases, the most difficult. Twisted hay, Grass from the prairie, twisted tightly into bundles that slowed the burn rate and concentrated the heat, became the primary fuel source for families without access to coal or wood. The hay-twisting machine, a simple device that could be manufactured by a competent blacksmith or even assembled from available materials, allowed a family to process prairie grass into fuel at a rate that made the otherwise overwhelming labor manageable. One settler's account records that the family went through as many as 40 twisted hay bundles in a single cold day, bundles that had to be constantly prepared and fed into the stove in a cycle that occupied at least one family member full-time during the coldest periods. Coal became available in many areas of the plains through the expansion of the railroad network in the 1870s and 1880s, and its introduction transformed the fuel economics of plains settlement in ways that are easy to underestimate. A ton of coal, deliverable by rail to a depot within wagon distance, contained more heat energy than several tons of buffalo chips or hay bundles. The family that could afford coal was freed from the constant, exhausting labor of fuel preparation and could redirect that labor to other survival tasks. The family that could not afford coal, or that was too far from a rail depot to make coal delivery practical, continued with the older fuel economy and its demands. The sod house, the iconic dwelling of the Great Plains settler, was not, as it is sometimes represented, a primitive and temporary shelter adopted in the absence of better options. It was a sophisticated response to a specific set of environmental conditions, and the best-built sod houses were genuinely effective at the primary task that Great Plains winter conditions demanded: keeping a family alive through 5 months of extreme cold without consuming more fuel than they could produce or afford. The thermal properties of sod are not intuitive to someone accustomed to wood frame construction. A sod wall 2 feet thick, the standard for permanent construction, has an insulating value that exceeds most wood frame walls of the era because the mass of the earth itself acts as a thermal buffer, absorbing heat slowly and releasing it slowly, dampening the temperature swings that a thinner wall would allow. A well-built sod house with a properly fitted door and windows in the right configuration could maintain a survivable interior temperature through a plains blizzard on a fraction of the fuel that an equivalent wood frame structure would require. The configuration mattered enormously. The door should face east or south, never north or northwest, from which the prevailing winter winds came. The windows should be small and double-paned if possible, because glass was a significant source of heat loss in any house of the era.
What will we
The
do
roof,
now,
typically
Papa?
constructed of a layer of boards or poles covered with a thick layer of sod, was both the most critical and the most problematic element. A well-laid sod roof added to the insulating envelope of the house. A poorly laid sod roof leaked, first water and then, as the sod dried and cracked in summer, fine dirt, in a continuous domestic inconvenience that the settlers described with a mixture of resignation and dark humor. The interior arrangement of the sod house in winter reflected the same calculated approach to heat conservation. The stove, typically a small cast-iron range, was positioned near the center of the main living space rather than against an exterior wall. Because heat radiates in all directions from a central source and an exterior wall loses heat to the outside. Beds were positioned away from exterior walls and toward the warmth of the stove. The animals. In the coldest periods, the most valuable animals might be brought inside the house itself, occupied the warmest corner that could be arranged. Because dead livestock in January was a catastrophe of a different order than the smell, the animals
right there,
were,
boy?
in a very real sense, the center of the
checking in on
winter
you all.
calculation. A Great
Good night,
Plains
my friends.
homestead was a system, food, fuel, shelter, and labor all interdependent, and the animals were the point at which most of these dependencies converged. The horses pulled the wagons that brought in the coal and the supplies. The oxen broke the soil in spring and fall. The milk cow provided the dairy products that were a significant component of the family's protein and fat intake through the winter. The chickens provided eggs. The pigs converted waste into meat. Lose the animals, and you did not merely lose the animals. You lost the system they were embedded in, and the consequences ramified in ways that were difficult to fully recover from. Keeping the animals alive through a Great Plains winter required fuel and fodder in quantities that competed directly with the fuel and fodder the family itself needed. The barn or stable had to be insulated against the cold, not to the degree of the house because animals generate their own heat, but sufficiently to prevent the temperatures that would cause frostbite and death in the most extreme conditions. The fodder. Hay, grain, whatever the farm had produced, had to be calculated to last the full length of the winter plus a reasonable reserve for the late springs that the plains regularly produced. When a March blizzard could extend the winter by weeks, at the moment when the hay supply was nearly exhausted, the calculation of fodder requirements was one of the places where experience most clearly distinguished the established settler from the newcomer. The newcomer who had arrived from a shorter winter climate calculated fodder based on what his animals needed in a normal winter of his previous experience. The experienced plains settler calculated on the basis of what his animals would need in the worst winter he had personally seen, plus a reserve. The difference between these two calculations could be substantial, and the consequences of the smaller calculation in a hard year were animals that grew thin in February, weaker in March, and dead before the grass came in April. The blizzard of 1888, the schoolchildren's blizzard of January, followed by the even more severe storms of the following winter, demonstrated the consequences of inadequate fodder calculation at a scale that the plains had not previously seen. Cattle herds that had been built through the boom years of the 80s on ranges that were overstocked relative to the carrying capacity of the land entered the winter of 1886-1887 without the fodder reserves that the experienced stockmen would have required. The winter that followed was severe. The losses were catastrophic. Estimates of cattle deaths range from 15 to 85% of the herds on the northern ranges. Ranchers who had operated on the calculation of normal winters found themselves facing a winter that was not normal, with animals that had no reserve and conditions that offered no supplement. The lesson was the same lesson that appeared in every domain of frontier survival. Prepare for the worst you have seen, not for the average you have experienced. The average is not what kills you. Children on the Great Plains homesteads occupied a specific and essential role in the winter economy that the romantic imagination of pioneer life has tended to obscure. They were not merely the beneficiaries of adult labor. They were themselves laborers, from the youngest ages at which useful work was possible, performing tasks that were essential to the family's survival. The collection of fuel was the most consistent of these tasks. Girls and boys from the age of 5 or 6 were expected to contribute to the gathering of buffalo chips, the carrying of hay, the filling of the fuel box beside the stove. In a family where the adults were occupied with the higher-skilled tasks of food preservation, animal care, and structural maintenance, the fuel supply was often managed primarily by children, a responsibility that was given not because adults were uncaring, but because the division of labor that survival required left no task unassigned. The education of these children happened in significant part through the direct transmission of survival knowledge, not in the formal sense of instruction, but in the practical sense of working alongside adults who knew what they were doing and learning by proximity and imitation. A 10-year-old who had spent 4 winters helping to twist hay bundles to stoke the stove to navigate between the house and the barn in conditions of limited visibility had acquired a body of practical knowledge about winter survival that was genuinely useful, and that the school curriculum of the era, where schools existed at all, which on the isolated plains was not always, did not, and could not provide. The school itself was a winter hazard on the plains in a specific and tragic way. The blizzard of January 12, 1888, the school children's blizzard, struck without warning in the early afternoon. After a morning of unusual warmth that had encouraged children and teachers to venture out without adequate cold weather gear, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Children who were in school at the blizzard's onset and who tried to walk home were caught in whiteout conditions without warm clothing. Many of them died within a few hundred yards of shelter that they could not see. The death toll among children was severe enough to shape the memory of that winter for a generation of plains families. The lesson drawn from this catastrophe, that weather on the Great Plains could change with a speed that made planning for current conditions dangerously inadequate, reinforced a principle that the experienced settler already understood: assume the worst case, not the present case. A morning of unusual warmth in January on the Great Plains was not evidence that the winter was relenting. It was, by the experience of those who knew the land, frequently a warning of what was coming. Water in winter presented a challenge that is easy to overlook from the perspective of a later time with indoor plumbing. Where did it come from? How was it stored, and how was it kept from freezing? Wells were the primary source for most plains homesteads, and the digging of a well was one of the first and most critical infrastructure tasks of any new settlement. A well that reached reliable water, typically 30 to 80 feet on the central plains, was a family's primary defense against the water problem of winter. But a well could freeze, or its rope and bucket mechanism could freeze in conditions of extreme cold, leaving the family dependent on alternatives. Snow was the obvious alternative, and the melting of snow for water was a standard winter practice on the plains. But snow as a water source has significant inefficiencies. A large volume of snow produces a small volume of water, and the energy required to melt enough snow for a family's daily needs, including the needs of the livestock, was substantial. The stove that was heating the house was also the only tool available for melting snow, and diverting its capacity to water production meant diverting it from space heating in conditions where space heating was critical. The insulation of water sources, the wrapping of wells and water storage vessels in straw and sod to prevent freezing, was one of the practical arts of plains winter management. A well housing built of sod, covering the well opening and trapping the earth's own warmth, could prevent freezing in all but the most extreme conditions. Water barrels in the root cellar, kept below the frost line, remained liquid through winters that froze everything above ground. The management of these systems, knowing when they were adequate and when they needed supplementation, was knowledge that accumulated through experience and was transmitted through the practical example of neighbors who had solved the problems before. The psychology of a Great Plains winter was a dimension of survival that the practical literature of the period rarely addressed directly, but that the diaries and letters of settlers acknowledged with significant frequency. 5 or 6 months of confinement in a space that was typically 1 or 2 rooms with the same small number of people in conditions of cold that made outdoor activity genuinely dangerous and often impossible, produced a specific kind of psychological pressure that the modern concept of cabin fever only partially captures. The darkness. The plains' winter days were short, and the interiors of sod houses poorly lit was one element. The noise of the wind, which on the open plains could be continuous for days, was another. The anxiety of the constant calculation. Is the fuel holding? Is the food adequate? Will this storm be the one that the preparation is not equal to? Was a third. The settlers who managed this pressure best were the ones who maintained the routines that gave the winter day structure and purpose. The reading aloud in the evenings, the handwork that produced useful goods while occupying hands and minds, the social visits between neighboring homesteads and the clear days between storms, conducted on horseback or by sled over distances that seemed impractical, but were made possible by the specific urgency of human contact after days of isolation. The settlers who managed it worst were the ones who were most isolated, literally by geography, and psychologically by the specific kind of self-sufficiency that the frontier mythology celebrated, but that winter on the plains could render genuinely dangerous. The family that was too far from neighbors to maintain any social contact through the winter, or that was too proud or too reserved to seek it, paid a psychological cost that sometimes manifested in ways that the laconic records of the era recorded only obliquely. The increasing brevity of journal entries through February and March, the references to an unnamed heaviness, the specific relief that runs through the first entries written after the thaw. The settlers who survived multiple Great Plains winters and built the homesteads that became the farms that became the agricultural infrastructure of the American Midwest were not primarily tough in the sense that the frontier mythology uses that word. Toughness, the capacity to endure hardship, was necessary but not sufficient. What was also required, and what the survivors consistently demonstrate in their records and their choices, was a particular quality of foresight, the willingness to do the necessary work in July that the winter would require in January, to think across a time horizon that extended well beyond the present season, to calculate what failure would cost and prepare against it, rather than simply hoping for a normal year. This quality, preparation against the worst case rather than for the average case labor invested now, against demands that would arrive later. The discipline to work hard in comfortable conditions because the uncomfortable conditions were coming and would be unforgiving, appears in variant forms in every domain of frontier survival that this channel has examined. It is the quality that the successful wagon train captains had and the failed ones lacked. It is the quality that made some frontier towns durable and others temporary. It is the quality that allowed people to survive in the desert, or to bring a child safely through a frontier birth, or to emerge from a Great Plains winter with family and animals and farm intact. It is not a glamorous quality. It does not produce dramatic stories. It produces the undramatic outcome of people who arrived at spring with what they needed, who had calculated correctly, who had done the unglamorous work of preparation without the certainty that the preparations would be needed in the exact form they had been made. The farmer who stacked more hay than he thought he would need who extended the depth of the root cellar by a foot beyond what seemed necessary, who positioned the barn door away from the northwest wind, not because he had experienced a particular storm, but because he had been told by someone who this farmer is not the hero of any story that history remembers. He is the farmer who was still farming in 1890, whose children went east to college, whose grandchildren inherited a working piece of land. His preparations made in the long summer afternoons of the 1870s are visible now only in the foundations of the structures he built, and the fact that his name appears in the census records of successive decades rather than disappearing after a single winter. But they are real, and they represent something important. The specific intelligence of people who understood that the land did not adjust its demands to match their expectations, and who chose to adjust their expectations to match the land. The winter still comes off the Great Plains in January, exactly as it always has. The temperature drops. The wind comes from the northwest. The snow moves horizontally across the flat land, and the visibility drops to nothing, and the world contracts to the small circle of warmth that preparation and fuel and insulation have made possible. Inside that circle, if the summer's work was done correctly, there is enough. Not comfort exactly. The standard of a Great Plains winter was not comfort, but enough warmth to stay alive, enough food to maintain the work of tending the fire and caring for the animals, enough fodder to bring the livestock through to spring, enough of the essential things to make it to the other side of the season and begin again. That was the standard the land set. That was the standard the survivors met. It is a quieter achievement than the ones that history tends to celebrate, but the land is still being farmed, and the families whose roots go back to those first homestead winters know something about it. Even if they cannot always name what it is they know, the wind does not ask whether you are ready. It comes when it comes, from the direction it always comes from, with the intensity that the season decides. The question the Great Plains has always asked is whether the preparation was adequate, whether the work of the long summer was equal to the demands of the long winter. The answer was given each spring, in the surviving and the not surviving, in the farms that continued and the farms that were abandoned, in the names that persisted in the records and the names that disappeared. The land kept its own accounting, as it always does, and it was honest, as it always is, and it did not apologize for either.